Hello everyone, Tim here. I have been meaning to try and make this video for several years now, but never got around to it or never felt motivated when I had the time, or just wasn't sure anybody would pay attention or have any interest in it. But since it's October and Halloween is coming soon, I thought I would finally sit down and discuss what I think a horror movie consists of. What is a horror movie? I'm sorry about all the stuff in the background here. I'm clearing out my storage space, and so I'm bringing stuff here in boxes and going through them all, and unfortunately having to sell and toss a lot of stuff. But clutter's been a part of my life most of my life, so I'm not really going to worry about it. Like I said, the topic I have is what is a horror movie, and I know everybody has their own idea, and the term is thrown around pretty loosely, but I have a pretty precise definition of what I think qualifies as a horror movie, and that is that it has to be something supernatural, something unexplainable, something occult, something just beyond anything that even science speculation could try and come up or fathom a reason for. So for me, a horror film, let's start with classics, the Universal classics. Dracula. Now we're going to be dealing with glare the whole time. There we go. Dracula, to me, is a horror film. He's undead, he's cursed. Any vampire film where the vampire is a real vampire, has to drink blood, turns into bats, mist, has supernatural abilities, is a horror film. Also from the early films would be The Mummy. Oh, hey, got that one. Mummy is obviously thousands of years dead. He's cursed, comes back to life, so mummy films fall into that undead category and supernatural, and therefore would be a horror film. Also of the Universal traditional horror films would be The Wolfman. He's cursed, inexplicably turns into a wolf whenever there's a full moon. So any Wolfman, any lycanthropy, transformational things based on a curse, magic, dark magic, occult, would be a horror film. But when we're talking about early classics, films that wouldn't be, for me, Universal films, that are often put into the horror category, and I know some people are going to disagree strongly with this, would be Frankenstein type movies. The monster is created. It may be pseudoscience or science fantasy, but it has a scientific gloss to it to explain the creature, and so it's not a supernatural. It's scary, but it's not a horror film to me. Also from Universal, The Invisible Man. This one's more obviously science fiction. He's a scientist, creates a chemical, but not a horror film. Lastly, of the classic Universal films, a little later, The Creature from the Black Lagoon. Creature from the Black Lagoon is an anomaly, a throwback. They give a pseudoscience explanation, you know, that this line of evolution died out or hasn't been discovered until they come across him. And so there's nothing supernatural about the Gilman. So it is not a horror film to me. Another early one would be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, obviously. He makes a formula, drinks it, becomes a monster, but is not a horror creation. As we go through this, I was hoping to have examples of all the films I'm going to talk to, and I want to keep it to a small number, limited. But I had let's just say someone close, someone with access to my DVDs and Blu-rays with a drinking problem. And so as I go through my shelves, I'm discovering that many of my DVDs and Blu-rays, many of my favorites actually, are not on the shelves anymore. They were pawned. And so that's going to make it a little harder. But one that is also an early film, Picture of Dorian Gray, would be a horror film because it has a supernatural element with the painting. Earlier films than that even, that are often lumped into horror, that I don't consider horror, would be The Hunchback of Notre Dame with Lon Chaney, or any of the versions, and also Lon Chaney, The Phantom of the Opera. I mean, there are very suspenseful scenes, and the creature is supposed to be, or the men are supposed to be creatures, horrifying to look at. But to me, this is a melodrama. These are melodramas. They're more about humans trapped in a monstrous appearance, and the monsters often turn out to be the humans and how they treat them, or have treated them. But there's nothing supernatural about these. There is a version of The Phantom of the Opera with Robert Englund that I like, that gives it a Faustian twist that I like, and that one I would consider a horror film. But these types of films, no. So with Frankenstein, now Frankenstein, like I said, not a horror film, but an earlier film, Der Golem, German silent film. The creature is created and imbued with magic. I don't find it really horrifying. It's more of a, well, there's horrific stuff, but I mean, it could almost be fantasy, folktale. But this would at least have an explanation that was non-scientific. It's created, it's brought to life by non-scientific means. Nosferatu, one of my favorite films, obviously horror film, vampire, first version, unofficial version of Dracula, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, not a horror film, both because the somnambulist in it, Caesar, is not supernatural, and then there's a twist at the end where they cheat it out so that you're not even sure what happened. So what types of films then do I consider horror? My personal favorite kind of horror are probably at the top of the list, and I couldn't find any. There are films that are turn out to be non-horror that you're not sure. I'm thinking of House on Haunted Hill, but I love haunted house films. So The Haunting, which has disappeared from my shelf. Legend of Hell House, which is a favorite of mine. Poltergeist films. One of my favorite Stephen King projects Rose Red. It was a mini-series. So anything with ghosts, spirits, is obviously a horror film. Now, one of my other favorites is called The Innocents, and that also is off my shelf. And in that film, and this is probably one of my favorite kind of horror films, if it's done right, or films, is you're left to ponder for yourself, is the story a horror film, or is it a psychological thriller and only taking place in the protagonist's mind? And it's an excellent film. By today's standards, it probably would be too slow for younger generations. It's black and white. But if you ever get the chance to check it out, The Innocents is about a governess who comes to take care of two very disturbing, creepy children. And the film unwinds slowly, and you'll have to decide for yourself what's real and what's unreal, what she's seeing and what she's imagining. And so I like that type of film. Occult films, this is one, if you've seen it, The Skull, with starring Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, about a cult writer, collector, underworld, and the skull is supposedly the skull of the Marquis de Sade, and is said to have magical powers. I actually like this little film. I couldn't get it for the longest time, and I got this copy, which I'm thinking is a bootleg. But as soon as there was a release, I got this one. Obviously, one of the all-time The Exorcist, a series of The Exorcist films, if you can watch all of them. Number 3 is excellent. Definitely a horror film. The Hellraiser series, I like the first 2. Horror film, occult connections with the box. Obviously, Pinhead and the other Cenobites, some kind of demons or extra dimensional. Whereas, and I haven't watched this one recently, and I'm hoping maybe this month I'll get to watch it. Whereas, this is a very disturbing film, the original The Wicker Man, Edward Woodward and Christopher Lee. As I've been thinking of the films I wanted to pull off the shelf today, this one came to mind. I do not remember anything that could not be explained. So that whether the magic or the occult worshippers or pagans are really having an effect with what happens in this film or not, I don't consider this one a horror film, whereas with The Innocents, I do, because I think it's happening. I don't think it's in her mind, but that's my interpretation. That's what's great about films like that, is that you can decide for yourself. So some of them walk that line, and people just have to agree to disagree. Creature features. A lot of these disappeared off my shelf, apparently. King Kong films, Godzilla, Them, Tarantula are 2 of my favorites. Lost World, Nature Gone Wild films are mad, like Frogs and the Birds, which is also missing off my shelf. Or unexplained, creatures attacking, Tremors. To me, these are not horror films. They're science fantasy, I guess you'd call them. Prehistoric monsters still being around, or Nature Gone Wild. They usually explain it with, environmental reasons or something like that. So, to me, they do not fall into the horror category, although, King Kong, Godzilla are considered staples. To me, they're not horror. I love them, but they're not horror. One of the interesting ones is, because it has probably more than 3 explanations, but are zombie films. The zombies aren't actually my favorite, but you know, they've really taken off. If you go to White Zombie with Bela Lugosi, that one's kind of a mix, because he's drugging them, but then at the end scene they're being shot and not killed. So early zombies are more of the voodoo zombies. Now, as we moved into the Romero era, Night of the Living Dead, they do not give an explanation, really. They speculate on some stuff. But to me, this one I would consider a horror film, because you have no idea why the dead have risen and why they're doing what they're doing. But then there came films where there were, and they were hinted in the first film, that there was some kind of chemical reaction. So Return of the Living Dead, excellent film. I actually like this zombie film a lot. It would not be horror, because the creatures are not supernatural. The bodies are reanimated by an agent, chemical agent, and so they wouldn't fall into the horror category, although they are horrifying, gross. They're not horror films by my strict definition. And then we moved on to films like 28 Days Later, where it's an illness, a virus, a disease that's bringing the dead back to life, or killing people and then animating them. So that one actually has a variety of explanations. Last one, and maybe the one, if anybody sees this video, I'll catch flack for, is slasher films. Now, I watched a lot of slasher films when I was younger. I graduated in '80, so my end of my high school year and into my early adulthood is when a lot of slasher films. But the first one I saw, obviously, was Psycho. And Psycho, there are so many iconic scenes in here that I think it will always remain a classic. But you couldn't make this, well, as they proved when they remade it with the color version, but it has its own pacing, and only Hitchcock, I think, could make it work. But not a horror film, it's a crime film, crime thriller, crime suspense thriller, about a serial killer. So to me, that's not horror. Also, Texas Chainsaw Massacre would fall into that category. There's nothing supernatural, unless they didn't tell us that the chainsaw came from hell or something. It's a crime thriller, suspense, more thriller than suspense. One that walks the line, but for me is a horror film, is Halloween. And the reason for that is, while you could explain away pretty much everything that happens, I mean, it'd be a stretch, but you could explain away most of what happens in the film, except for I think the final scene where if you haven't seen it by now, spoiler alert, but I mean, it's been a while since the film's been out. They even remade it, you might have heard. When he's shot multiple times, falls out the window, and then the body's not on the ground later when they go out to look the window, upper story window to the ground, that pretty much tells me he is the boogeyman. He's not a normal human killer, and they go on throughout the series to make that very clear. So for me, this is a horror film, and one of my favorite films of all time. From the moment I saw the opening with the POV shot and the murder, and then that reveal of who was behind the mask, I was hooked. Now, Friday the 13th started out as a non-horror, because there's a rational explanation of slasher behind, but as the series went on, it became horror. straight out horror from the very beginning would be A Nightmare on Elm Street in the series. Freddy is horror. I mean, there's a lot of humor and sick humor, dark humor, gallows humor, but it's a horror film. He's a twisted individual, but he is supernatural. But then, after the craze ran out, both in series like Psycho, we went back to Silence of the Lambs and Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, serious films, and that's what I think a lot of these films are. They're over the top, some of the slasher films, but they fall in that genre of serial killer films, not horror films. And in the more openly slasher types, we had the Scream series, which I enjoy, and so that would be a non-horror film for me also. So that's my narrow-minded opinion on what makes up the category of horror films. Obviously, I've left a lot of films out just because it would take forever, and a lot of the films I wanted to show weren't on the shelf. I mean, one of the most famous, after the Universal and Hammer films, of course, is Vincent Price, and he's considered a horror actor. But a lot of his films fall into the category. This is one of my favorite films growing up, House of Wax. Not a horror film. He's a killer. He's disfigured. I'd put him in the category with Phantom of the Opera. He's a man who's been disfigured and seeking revenge. When I was young, we had a, maybe I've mentioned this before, a afternoon matinee movie on our independent channel. Mel Jazz was the host. It was Mel's Matinee. And it seemed like once a month or once every 6 weeks or so, they would show this film. And it was amazing that every time it came on, I came down with some illness that scared my parents to death, and they were convinced I was going to die. I had to walk a fine line between getting rushed to the hospital and being allowed to stay home. But I would stay in bed and moan and be miserable. And around 10 minutes to 1 o'clock, I'd drag myself to the couch, and I would sit down, lay down, bundle up, and I would watch this film over and over again. Whereas, of course, he's been in a ton of horror films. One of my favorite is, it's in the Poe series, Roger Corman Poe series, but it's really based on an H.P. Lovecraft story, and it's called The Haunted Palace. And if you've never seen it, I would really suggest checking it out. It is one of my favorite films of his, one of the adaptations I enjoy the most of Lovecraft, along with the Reanimator films, and the Call of Cthulhu film, Cthulhu. But I'm going to leave it there. If anybody sees this, I would love to hear your opinions. I'd love a response video, whether you agree or disagree. If there's anyone you think would enjoy discussing this, I encourage you to share the video or send them the link. I would love as much feedback as I can in the comments section. I would really love to see some videos of what you think is a horror film and what isn't a horror film, and I'd love to hear why. Not sure I'll be making any videos before Halloween, so just in case I don't, happy Halloween to everybody. Take care.